We shall never surrender.
One small step for man.
I have a dream.
Those who do not know real quotes are condemned to repeat bogus quotes. Let's join Professor Buzzkill for Quote or No Quote.
There's an old Buzzkill curse. May you subscribe to interesting podcasts. If you do, your life will become so gloriously enlightened with new information presented in such an engaging way that you'll forget to feed your cat, you'll mix your laundry colors, and you'll neglect taking your medication. That reminds me of another famous, I'm putting that in quotations, curse from a source that's famous for enlightenment and wisdom, ancient China. That wise culture is full of notable aphorisms and sayings, and the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, is the subject of today's quote or no quote. Lots of people are credited with bringing this wisdom and this warning to the English-speaking world. 19th century British politicians and diplomats, writers such as Albert Camus and Arthur C. Clarke, and American politicians such as Robert F. Kennedy and even Hillary Clinton. You'll sometimes hear it in slightly different constructions. May you live in exciting times, may you live in an interesting age. And as a curse, it means that interesting times are usually full of turmoil and difficulty, and it conveys the somewhat disheartening reflection about human nature that trouble and strife always seem to be more interesting to us than order and calm. Now, there are certainly far more history books written about war and famine than about peace and plenty. Here's the problem with the Chinese curse of living in interesting times. There's no evidence or record of such a curse in Chinese culture, ancient or modern. And there's certainly no literary evidence that it comes from China. Given that writing and philosophy have been so important in China for thousands of years, it's highly unlikely that something as pithy and philosophical as may you live in interesting times would have been passed down completely through an oral tradition. The closest Chinese maxim or Chinese phrase or Chinese saying seems to be one from Stories to Awaken the World, a collection of short stories written in 1627, at least published in 1627. Two of the stories express a basic idea similar to May You Live in Interesting Times. Both relate to the difficulties of living through the devastation of war, and they express, quote, truly better to be a dog in days of peace than a human in times of war. So how did we end up with the curse of living in interesting times? Well, all the evidence seems to suggest that it traveled through the British diplomatic and political corps from the 1830s to the 1930s. In a book called The Chinese, a general description of the Empire of China and its inhabitants, published in 1836, British diplomat John Francis Davis wrote, quote, the Chinese have lived so much in peace that they have acquired by habit and education a more than common horror of political disorder. Better to be a dog in peace than a man in anarchy is a common maxim, unquote. Now, by the late 19th century, British politicians and the chattering classes were using the phrase, we live in interesting times. And by the early 20th century, this basic idea had transformed into a Chinese curse or warning, and we were off to the misattribution races. I know a boring era might be easier on the old Buzzkill blood pressure, but aren't you glad to be living in a time when you can hear my lovely tones tell you all about history? Talk to you next week.